Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Paige, and I want to thank the Museum of Fine Arts for this invitation to speak with you all today. I recall it was almost 6 years to this week that I was here also doing a lecture in conjunction with a Toulouse-Lautrec. I don't know if any of you were at that lecture. Yes, okay, good. Well, welcome back. But I'm delighted to be here to talk about a bounty for the senses. And just by a show of hands, how many people have actually visited Provence? Okay, good amount of you. That's great. So you have an idea of some of the things that we'll be discussing today. I wanted to focus more on the other senses. When we look at a lot of Van Gogh's works, we are really impressed by the visual beauty of Provence. But there's so much else that surrounds these visuals, the flavors, the tastes, and the scents of Provence. Hopefully you had something to eat before you came here, because you're definitely going to get a little hungry during this talk. Unfortunately, I can't do a tasting in this auditorium, but hopefully it will inspire you to go out and actually try some of these things that were surrounding Van Gogh while he was in Provence and that you can still experience today. So just as a reminder, my name is Erkia Frey. I am certified sommelier, a certified wine educator, and I am the education director at the Commonwealth Wine School, which is in Harvard Square. So hopefully you can come visit us there as well. And I'm going to start off by just recapping a little information about Van Gogh's time in Provence. It was a very brief period. Only just a little over 2 years was Van Gogh living in Provence, first in the city of Arles, and then in Saint-Remy. Even though this was a short period, it was a very prolific time of Van Gogh's work, and probably this is when he created the most of his paintings, and certainly some of his most famous paintings, the ones that we all can recognize. This is also the time when Van Gogh officially became a landscape painter. This was something that drew him to Provence, the ability to work outside, outdoors, and in the warmth, with the beautiful colors and dazzling sunlight that we find in Provence. So this is one of the things that drew him there. And because of that, we know a lot of his famous landscape paintings. In the exhibit that's here in the MFA today, we focus on the portraiture of a family that he befriended in his time in Arles. So that's another aspect of Van Gogh's work. So I wanted to just give a little background first, before we dive into some of the scents and the flavors and the tastes, a little background about Provence and why this place is so special. So Provence is in the southeastern corner of France, and it's a pretty large area here. I'm gonna see if I have a pointer. I do, right? So here's Provence, and it's bordered to the east by Italy and also the Alps. In fact, the Alps takes up about 1/3 of Provence. So there's very mountainous regions on the sort of eastern third of Provence. We also have, of course, the Mediterranean Sea to the south, which certainly defines a lot of the culture, the history, and the foods and things that you experience in Provence. Let me just go to the west, the Rhone River. So the Rhone River is the border between Provence and then Languedoc to the west. So it's a pretty large area with a lot of variety. So the terrain is very varied. There's mountains, there's coastline, there are little mountains, there are wetlands, there are plains. And all of this variety also lends itself to the variety that we find in the agriculture, the food, the flavors, the scents that we can get from Provence. The climate here is Mediterranean, which makes sense. It's right next to the Mediterranean, but what does that really mean? In the Mediterranean region, most of the rainfall happens in the wintertime, which means for the rest of the year, the prevailing weather is sunny, warm, and dry. So this is a place where things thrive, not just people, but animals, plants, and so this is why we get so much abundance of especially produce, seafood, things like that from Provence. I wanted to give a few selected points of history, which just, again, give you a little bit of a foundation. Marseille, which is the city here, is actually one of the oldest, if not the oldest, cities in France. It was colonized by a Greek peoples called the Phocaeans, not to be confused with the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were different. The Phoenicians also did a lot of sailing and colonized a lot of places, but the Phocaeans were the ones that established their colony of Massalia, which became Marseille, modern-day Marseille. So this was around 600 BCE. And that was followed by the Romans. The Romans expanded into this part of what is now France, and they called it Nostra Provincia, our province. And this is the background for the name Provence, right? So Provence comes from the Latin Provincia. And of course, with the Greeks and the Romans came a lot of other things, probably war, but also prosperity, grapevines, wine, things like that. So they had a tremendous impact, making Provence really like one of the oldest wine regions also of France. We'll get to that towards the end. I'm going to jump ahead, probably now almost a couple thousand years, to another pivotal moment, which was the establishment of a rail line between Paris and Marseille. And this is what really connected Provence to the rest of the world in a way. Like it connected Marseille to Paris, which was like connecting Marseille to the rest of the world, really. And that's how Vincent van Gogh got to Provence, and many others like him were able to travel to Provence using the rail line, which only took a day, not too bad, right? But it basically opened up this other world for these artists, intellectuals, vacationers, people looking for health. So a lot of people came to Provence that way, and also a lot of things left Provence that way. So wines, produce, products started to become introduced to the rest of the world from Provence through the rail line to Paris and other parts of the world. So I'm going to start off with the sense of Provence. And maybe I should have brought like a little aerator or something here to put some sense into the room. But those of you who have visited Provence, you certainly probably remember the sense of Provence. There are abundant flowers here, right? So fields and fields of flowers that are both cultivated but also wild flowers, herbs like lavender, thyme, rosemary. So these are herbs that tend to grow in places where other things just can't grow. And when you look at the landscape of Provence, remember the mountains. There are these rocky, very limestone-driven mountains in Provence, and not a lot can grow on these rocky terrains. But rosemary, lavender, these sort of aromatic herbs, they seem to survive and thrive in this environment. So certainly lavender is one of the signature scents of Provence. And if you've seen postcards, you've probably seen the beautiful fields blooming. I think that's a little bit more for the pictures, because usually when you pick lavender, you should pick it before it blooms if you're going to use it. But you probably walked into a souvenir shop or a market, and it was just lavender everything, right? Lavender sachets, lavender soaps, lavender candles, lavender soap. It is something that is definitely synonymous with Provence. And it's something that's been there for a long time. Lavender has often been used as medicine, as something that you would soak in, right, to calm your nerves, to make you smell better. The root word for lavender is actually laver, which in French means to wash, right? So there's something about washing and bathing that is associated to the scent of lavender. So it is definitely prevalent in Provence. So you can imagine, even though Van Gogh doesn't really talk a lot about what he smells, when you see some of these paintings, you can imagine the smells, the lavender, the flowers, the herbs. When he first arrived in Arles, it was February, and they said unusually there was a huge snowfall when he arrived, but even still, the blossoms on the trees were starting to poke out. And so one of the first series of paintings that he did in Arles was of the orchard. So this picture here is a pink peach tree. And of course, these blossoming trees are throughout, whether it's citrus trees, peach trees, almond trees, plum trees. I think he painted all of them. And so you can imagine, again, the sense of the blossoming trees that also inspired the environment of Van Gogh. Another place I wanted to talk about in Provence in relation to scents is the city of Grasse. Did anyone go to Grasse when they were there? Yep. So Grasse is famous for perfumes. And of course, all of the herbs and the flowers that naturally grow in Provence are taken advantage of in Grasse, basically to make all of these different scents. Interestingly enough, that's not how Grasse originally got famous. They were famous as a place to make leather. So there was a lot of tanneries, a lot of leather production, and it didn't smell very nice. And one of the ways they tried to cover up the smells or to make their products a little bit more attractive was to create scents that would cover up sort of the earthy animal smells of the leather, of the tanning. And eventually, that became all the rage. Scented handmade leather gloves, right? Sounds delightful, right? And at some point, probably in the 18th, 19th century, the perfume started to outgrow the leather. So now the city is really mainly known for its perfume. These three companies I listed have been there for hundreds of years: Gallimard, Molinard, and Fragonard, and you can still visit them today, along with dozens of other parfumeries, perfume manufacturers in Grasse. Now, this is my picture of lavender. I didn't get to go see the extensive lavender fields here, but I like this picture because you can see some of that rocky terrain in the background, right? That's something that you see a lot in Van Gogh's landscape paintings. And you can also see an olive tree, right? Olive is another important product for Provence that we will talk about. All right. So now we're getting hungry, right? So I wanted to talk about some of the foods and some of the tastes that you would experience, or maybe Van Gogh also experienced. He doesn't talk a lot about food. In all reality, he probably didn't eat a lot. We'll get to that as well. He didn't seem to have a very good diet, but certainly bread was one of the things that kept him going. And bread is certainly a main staple of most French diets, whether you're in Provence or in northern France. But of course, you know that there's many, many different styles of bread. Wheat is important. When you look at the landscape paintings of Van Gogh, there's many wheat fields, there's many pictures of harvesting wheat. That's because he was surrounded by it. It was growing everywhere around both Arles and Saint-Remy. So the opening slide that I had was his view out his window in Saint-Remy of the wheat fields being harvested. So wheat plays an important role, and bread. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples of some Provençal styles of bread and also of a cookie. So what you see in the picture here is fougasse. Fougasse is a bread. It's a flat bread. It's usually not super risen or proofed, and it's related to breads like focaccia, right? So it's kind of a flatter bread, same root word as focaccia. Basically, this was the bread that was put onto the hearth to test if it was hot enough to cook with. So the fougasse or the focaccia both come from the Latin word focus, which means hearth. And so you can find versions of this bread throughout sort of the old Roman Empire. And the very interesting thing about fougasse is usually when you see fougasse, they slash the bread so it makes little holes. And usually the pattern resembles a grain of wheat. So if you see it in the bread, you can see the slashes, and it looks like a little grain of wheat, or the head of the wheatgrass, right? Which I think is very symbolic. And oftentimes fougasse, you can find it plain, but it also can be mixed with some of the local specialties. So olive is very common in fougasse. Garlic, onion, herbs like rosemary. So these are things that are typically found mixed into the dough. And that just gives you this whole little bite of Provence in this bread. I also wanted to point out another specialty which comes from Marseille, which is a biscuit called the navette. So this is, again, it's a wheat flour-based biscuit, but it has some tie-in to the scents of Provence because it is typically scented with orange blossom water, right? So thinking back to the perfumes, the flowers, even their cookies will have a perfume to them, right? So the navette is a specialty cookie that comes from Marseille. Moving on to vegetables. Lots and lots and lots of vegetables in Provence. This is a place where, again, just about anything you want to grow will grow and will grow well. So the diet in Provence has tons and tons of vegetables in it. And we have certainly some major players, such as onions and garlic, right? And I think the only vegetable I remember seeing in Van Gogh's paintings when I was doing the research for this talk was onions, basically. Sprouting onions, usually. There's a few paintings where he has these sprouting onions. Not much else shows up in his work that I can remember. And I even wondered if it was the same onions that we would see in the paintings. He was not known for his culinary acumen. So basically, that was just something that he would paint or include in his paintings. But certainly onion and garlic are some basic ingredients that are pretty much in every Provençal dish. And some of the things that you might recognize or I'd like to introduce you to are some specialties of Provence, like pistou. Pistou, very similar to pesto, right? Again, probably the same root word, sort of a mashup of making a paste. And this is basil, garlic, and olive oil, but without the nuts and the cheese that you usually find in like an Italian pesto. And this is often, pistou is usually there to flavor things, flavor soups. You know, you could probably flavor other dishes with it, but often you can have like a vegetable soup with the pistou that you mix in to the soup and it flavors the soup. We also have aioli, right? So the two dots over the I mean that you pronounce it separately. So it's aioli, aioli. And it's basically a garlic and olive oil emulsion. Sometimes other stuff is mixed in, like eggs, potato, to give it some substance. It often has sort of a mayonnaise-y type consistency, but it is something, again, that is used to flavor things, flavor soups, flavor, spread on bread, flavor vegetables, things like that. So aioli has a Provençal origin. And probably everybody's favorite, ratatouille, right? Ratatouille, very fun to say. This is a vegetable stew or like terrine, right? Which is usually based on eggplant, tomato, zucchini, bell pepper, other things as well, but certainly garlic and onion make appearances, as well as herbe de Provence, right? Herbe de Provence, the lavender, the rosemary, the thyme. So these are very typical dishes. And they're not super fancy dishes, right? Provençal cuisine wasn't really, I think, developed as a cuisine until this time period, sort of the 18th, 19th century, is when other people started recognizing, oh, Provence cuisine. But often these dishes were not fancy dishes. They were what people ate every day. You know, so the abundant vegetables, the herbs, the garlic, and the onions. This is my picture from the market in Aix-en-Provence. So we have some beautiful artichoke here that are actually blooming. We've got some carrots in the foreground here, something that looks like maybe spinach or some sort of greens, and of course, sprouting onions, right, in the true vein of Van Gogh. So other things, fruit, just as abundant as vegetables. We have lots of fruits, tree fruits, right? Apples, plums, peaches, citrus fruit can grow in Provence. Lemons, oranges, tree nuts, almonds often grew in Provence. There is another specialty sweet called the calisson, which is basically ground up almonds mixed with candied melon. And this is a specialty from Aix-en-Provence. So Aix-en-Provence. So the Marseille had the navette, the orange blossom scented biscuit. And then in Aix-en-Provence, they had the calisson, the almond and candied melon sweet. It was similar to marzipan, but then also flavored with fruit, usually with an icing over it. So these were things that were usually eaten during celebration periods. And of course, we have grapes, not just for wine, but also for food. So I'll talk about wine in another slide, but certainly grapes grow abundantly in Provence. Grapes are usually not very picky about where they grow. They can grow in some of the places where a lot of other things can't. They don't need a lot of water. They do like sunshine. They do like the dry climate. So you would see grapes being used both for eating, probably raisins, dried fruit as well, and certainly for wine. Then comes the olive, right? The olive is super important in Provence. Olive and olive oil are really what differentiate southern French cuisine from northern French cuisine, right? They usually say the north uses the butter and the south uses the olive oil, right? And so olive oil is definitely there. We saw it in the aioli, right? That is used, you're making aioli with olive oil. You could use olives as fruit, as vegetables, as things to mix into things. So olives are all around in Provence. Hopefully you all like olives. I know that's usually a divisive thing, but certainly you'll experience a lot of olives in Provence. And also it's used for different products. I'm sure a lot of cosmetics and things will have olive oil in them, but they also have a soap industry that was very famous, again, in the turn of the century between the 19th and the 20th century in Marseille. And the soap was at one point only made from olive oil, but because of the demand, they had to start using other vegetable oils to make these soaps. So if you're looking for the pure Savon de Marseille, which is the soap from Marseille, it's 72% olive oil. It doesn't look that pretty. It's kind of a green color, often sold in a block, right, which they would slice to get the sort of bars of soap. So if you're going shopping for Savon de Marseille, you know, the pretty pink ones and yellow ones, those are not the olive oil soaps, probably. The pure one is that green soap. And that was good for the skin, very soothing, so it was a very popular soap. I don't really have a lot to say about meat, because there isn't a lot. If you look at a Provence cookbook, meat plays a very minor role here. They don't have an industry really of raising beef cattle. It is more things like sheep. So the most common meats were lamb and mutton at the time Van Gogh was living in Provence. Sometimes game, for instance, rabbit or wild boar, things like that are eaten. But meat is not as major of a part of the diet. But what is food from the sea, right? So this is a painting that Van Gogh did in June. So he arrived in February. He painted the fruit trees blooming in like April, May, and then he finally took a trip out to the sea. So Arles is not on the coast, it's a little bit inland, so he had to take, again, a train, or I think actually he took a carriage to the sea. And this is a town called Les Saintes Maries de la Mer, right, the St. Mary's of the sea. So being at the Mediterranean Sea, you have all types of seafood. So all of it is part of the Provence diet. So everything from shellfish, crustaceans, octopus, ocean fish. They have a lot of mullet, tuna, anchovies, mackerel. So all of these things can be found in Provence dishes. So I included a couple of classic dishes. Again, these are dishes that are not necessarily fancy dishes. They were the dishes of normal people, right? This is stuff that wasn't very expensive to make, but these are the dishes that sort of put Provence on the French culinary map because they were very unique to that region. So we have the 3 B's, bourride, which is a fish stew that is made using the aioli, right, which is the garlic and olive oil sauce. Probably most famous is bouillabaisse. Bouillabaisse is from Marseille. It's a Marseille specialty. And it was usually made with the leftover fish, or the fish that they couldn't sell, right? So this was not usually the highest quality fish. It was mostly not shellfish, but finned fish. And they would take the leftovers, cook it up. They would boil it and then let it simmer. So bouillabaisse means sort of boil and then like simmer down or boil down, right? So the broth, again, probably had tomatoes and herbs and the typical Provence type produce, but then with the fish in it. Now, of course, you can get fancy bouillabaisse with like shellfish and things like that in it as well. But the typical bouillabaisse was just the leftover fish, a very simple meal. And then we have brandade. So brandade is a spread, or like a terrine made from salt cod, right? So salt cod was a very common way of preserving fish. And this would be salt cod mixed with garlic, olive oil, usually potatoes. So it was kind of like almost like a mashed potato type consistency, but something that you could then spread on bread or just eat plain, but something where you could actually use preserved fish and then have that as part of a meal. So the 3 B's from the sea. Ooh, so when I was in Provence, one of my favorite meals, I'll tell this story because I love this story. One of my favorite meals was we went to a winery in a region called Bandol. And Bandol is very famous for very hearty red wine. And the producer was kind of nervous. We were a group of wine students coming to visit, and he was kind of nervous that we would be kind of stuck-up, snobby wine people and not really appreciating what he was doing for us, which was giving us a real sort of taste of country Provençal hospitality. So he had these mussels basically cooking on the embers, right, underneath rosemary, which was delicious. There was just loaves of bread that we just tore with our hands, and so we were like dipping it into the sauce with that. He also, he basically hunted his own wild boar, because wild boar are pests. If you have a vineyard, the wild boar wants to eat your grapes. So the wild boar for him were pests, and we got to have them for lunch as well. So he made a terrine with wild boar, and we had it with the rosé first. We had the mussels with the rosé, and then we had white wine, and then we had this rich red wine with the wild boar terrine. And it was, outside, but under a covered terrace, and it was probably the best meal that I had in Provence. To me, that was really what Provence, the essence of Provence was. The sunshine, the sort of dusty vineyard, the food in front of us, the wine flowing, that to me was one of my favorite moments in Provence. So this to me was Provence. We also went to some very fancy restaurants. So this was another dish that we had, a little bit more, I think, curated, higher end, I guess. I believe this is red mullet that's then grilled, and I'm sure there's olive oil in here. There might even be butter here too. But then the vegetables, right? Tomato, onion, probably garlic on top of it. So that is also very quintessentially Provençal. All right, are we getting thirsty yet? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about wine. That's my specialty. So wine certainly, as I said, grapes thrive in this condition. They like the dry conditions. You can imagine when you have humidity and you have this bunch of grapes, what happens is all the humidity gets trapped in between the grapes, and that's where fungus and mold start to come in. So a Mediterranean climate that's warm and dry is actually pretty easy for people who are practicing viticulture, right? The growing of grapes. And so, there's no problem growing grapes here. Certainly, it has not always been high quality grape growing, so we'll talk about that. But like I said, Provence is probably one of France's oldest wine regions. They think there maybe were some grapes growing in France, or what we know as France now, or Provence as well, but maybe not really formally or in a very regular way being made into wine. And it wasn't until the Greeks and then the Romans came that they brought vines with them, but they also brought knowledge, because they already had pretty established knowledge about how to make wine, how to store wine, how to produce wine, right? In a form that was maybe just not haphazard or just for personal consumption. So really Provence is where viticulture got its start in France. In the Greek times, they usually would lightly press the grapes. So you can imagine if you're just lightly pressing the grapes, the juice comes out, and it's usually very fruity, sweet. There's a little bit of acidity in there as well, but it's very pure. And they would make the wine from that juice. And that wine, unfortunately, would not last very long, so you'd have to drink it pretty quickly. If you couldn't drink it quickly, they often preserved it with other things like seawater and salt and maybe resins and things like that, which didn't make it taste much like wine anymore. But oftentimes this wine was the purest wine. It was usually reserved for the higher class people. This was the best stuff. The Romans supposedly brought knowledge of red wine making. So to make wine red, you need to macerate the juice of the grape with the skins of the grape. And the skins is what gives the wine its color, but also flavor and something called tannin, right? So tannin is what dries your mouth out. So when you drink red wine and you feel like your mouth drying out, that's the tannin that's coming from the grape skins. And it's a very good preservative. So red wines in that sense could sometimes last longer and also maybe even improve after a little bit of time. And this is a painting that Van Gogh did with the green vineyard. This vineyard is not the most well manicured. If you've ever visited a vineyard around here, usually they're in these nice straight rows. So you can see this one, the vines are kind of going all over the place. So I'm sure the grapes were good, but maybe they weren't the best taken care of in this situation. These vineyards look a little bit more well curated, but it's kind of in the distance here. So during the time of Van Gogh, wine was definitely a staple, just like it is in most French diets. Today, maybe it's becoming less of a staple, but wine for the French was like water. It's something that you would drink. It wasn't necessarily something fancy or something for a special occasion. It's what you would have with your meals, right? It's the drink you had with your meals. But in Provence, even though it was a staple, it was usually not very high quality wine. What they would do is oftentimes they would plant a lot of grapes together in the same vineyard. They wouldn't necessarily know which varieties of grapes were planted. They would just sort of be mixed in together. And that meant that they were also harvested together. And grapes will sometimes ripen at different points. So when you harvest everything together, you're going to have some unripe grapes, some ripe grapes, maybe some grapes past their prime, and that all gets mixed together to make wine. And so Van Gogh would often talk about wine, but he was usually complaining about it. He was complaining about the Provence wine. He at one point said that it was sour and it tasted like poison. So he wasn't all that impressed with the wines that he was able to drink. And that was usually the wine that was available in the cafes. Certainly, he wasn't the type to be seeking out the famous Bordeaux or anything like that. This was just a drink for Van Gogh. So, the wine, even though important, was not usually the best quality. Also, during this time, which was the late 1800s, there was something else happening that was kind of devastating the wine industry, not just in France, but throughout Europe. And it was basically this pest that was introduced through plant material from here, from North America, and it was imported to France, and it's basically a minuscule little root louse that fed on the sap of grapevines. In North America, we also have grapevines that are native to North America, but they have developed defenses against this louse. So even though the louse exists, our grapevines, our native vines can survive. In Europe, not the case. So when the root louse came to Europe, it I wouldn't say quickly, I would say it slowly spread, but it pretty much spread throughout Europe and destroyed all of the vineyards. So you can imagine, this was a crisis, right? This was a crisis, especially for the French. So they were trying to figure out all different ways to make wine in different places, because it actually started close to Provence. It started kind of in the Rhone Valley area, and then it slowly spread throughout France and then throughout Europe. And they tried at first I think they tried to breed the American vines with the European or the Eurasian vines that we use to make wine. And that had some mixed results. We call these hybrid vines, or French-American hybrids. We still see those in use today. But the eventual solution was to graft the Eurasian vine that we make wine with. So that's a species called Vitis vinifera, vinifera meaning to make wine. And this is a grapevine that originated somewhere between like Europe and Asia. Some people theorize maybe the Caucasus region. And this is what we usually make wine with, these grapes. So the Chardonnays, the Rieslings, the Pinot Noirs, the Cabernet Sauvignons, these are all from that species of grape. And the eventual solution was to graft that Vitis vinifera onto the roots of an American grapevine. So most of the grapevines in the world are actually grafted onto American roots. So we gave them the problem, but we also gave them a solution. But of course, this was tough, right? Because most of the vineyards were recovering from this. And when people were finally able to plant vines again, they weren't so concerned about making high quality wine. They just wanted to make a lot of wine. So a lot of the grapes that they did plant were not considered the highest quality. They were the ones that would produce a lot of volume, but not necessarily the best wine. So this was another factor which maybe made the wine less than impressive for Van Gogh. Of course, now in Provence, if you have visited, or I'm sure you're maybe partaking of it here, is rosé. So rosé in today's wine world is really inspired by the style of Provence that, the style of rosé that Provence made famous, right? And this is kind of similar to maybe what the Greeks were drinking way back when they first came, and they just gently pressed the grapes. When you gently press the grapes, especially red grapes, you get a little bit of color, not a lot of that tannin that dries your mouth out, and then sort of these fresh flavors, right? So things like reminiscent of strawberries or red berries or flowers or melon. And 90% of the wine that Provence produces today is this style of rosé that's dry, meaning not sweet, but light in color with these sort of floral and fruity flavors. And these are typically wines that you don't want to age, similar to what we talked about with the Greeks, because they just don't, the flavors that they create don't hold up over time. So usually they're drunk relatively young and fresh. All right, so another thing that we know that Van Gogh took part in a lot was coffee. And coffee pretty much fueled him. When you read his letters to his brother Theo, he talks a lot about coffee, wine, maybe occasionally some absinthe, some bread, but certainly he was no foodie. You know, he was really driven by his work. He didn't really have time to eat. It didn't really seem like he had the desire really to eat well, especially if he had to be part of it. When he finally invited Gauguin to live with him and paint with him, I think Gauguin said, Van Gogh tried to cook something and it was inedible. Like we just couldn't eat it. So Gauguin ended up being the chef, basically, for them. So there's been many mentions of Van Gogh just really not being a good cook, and certainly his diet really was coffee, wine, bread, and he also smoked a pipe. So usually in his paintings there was always a pipe and maybe a tobacco pouch present. But certainly he was inspired by cafes, and cafes came from the culture of drinking coffee, right? Coffee is not native to France. It came probably through Turkey or through Armenia. In fact, I think it was an Armenian who actually opened the first cafe in Marseille in 1671. But it quickly became a drink that everyone liked, the feeling of energy that it gave them, but it also became an excuse to convene and to socialize. So that's where the cafe culture started, where you had cafes which would serve coffee, but not only coffee, other beverages as well, wine, absinthe, food, and these would be places where intellectuals and artists or politicians would convene to discuss things, but eventually it became the place where everyone would go to sort of unwind, to socialize, to be together with each other. So this painting is pretty famous. This was a cafe in the town of Arles, where Van Gogh really wanted to work on scenes done in the evening, right? Painting it at night. And so you can see the light, the very warm light that's being shed here under the awning. You can see the start of his sort of starry night technique here in the sky. And so this cafe looks very warm and inviting. However, there was the other side of cafes, right? So cafes, not only were they places to socialize and to unwind, but Van Gogh also felt there was sort of this insidious feeling about cafes, that these were places where also bad things could happen, right? So this is another painting also in Arles of another cafe. This was the Café de la Gare, which is one of the places where Van Gogh stayed. And you can see here, the coloring is a little bit different, right? It's more green and red. The lights have these sort of aggressive sort of halos around them, right? There's something kind of nervous and anxious about this painting. And he writes in his letters, I've tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place where you go to ruin yourself, go mad, commit crimes. And of course, we already know that Van Gogh probably most likely suffered from mental illness. And this is maybe one of the things that he was feeling, this sort of pull within him. Like, he loved the cafes, but also the cafes were something that was almost bringing him down, in a sense. And you can see here in the cafe, we have many bottles, right? On the back sort of counter there's dozens of bottles here. Amongst the tables, there are bottles strewn. There are glasses that, if you look closely enough, you can probably pick out absinthe glasses, which have a special shape. They're kind of like not quite like a champagne flute, but sort of that triangular shape. There's even a seltzer bottle, which is also used for drinking absinthe, so I'll talk a little bit about that. You can see some people kind of slumped over. It's pretty late. You can even read the clock. This is after midnight. So he was sort of alluding to the fact that cafe culture for him could also be something maybe not so pleasant, and maybe something that where he was feeling some of his bouts of madness, quote unquote, coming about. So let's talk about absinthe, because absinthe is one of the things, like what we would talk about some of our modern drug epidemics. Absinthe is often referred to as something rather evil, although, it hasn't really been proven, that affected people in this period of sort of the late 1800s and early 1900s. So what is it? It is a distilled spirit infused with botanicals such as green anise, sweet fennel, and grand wormwood. And it was the wormwood, which contains a compound called thujone, which was thought to cause psychedelic effects. Thought, but not really proven to cause it. For a while, absinthe has actually been banned, right? So it also was a very high alcohol spirit. It was about 70% ABV, alcohol by volume, which is 140 proof. That's pretty high alcohol. So it was meant to be diluted. Whether people actually diluted it or how much they diluted it is maybe another question. It also had a ritual that went with it, which I think became almost like a craving. When people started going through the ritual, it was like a craving, like I'm going to get my fix now, right, for absinthe. So you can see here the glass. This is a typical absinthe glass. The absinthe by itself is sort of a clear green color. And then it would go along with this fancy slotted spoon. So the slotted spoon would be put on top of the glass. A sugar cube would be put onto the spoon. And then there would be water or seltzer poured over the sugar cube into the glass. That would sweeten the absinthe and dilute it. But because there's anise in it, it actually changed the look of the drink. So it would actually make the drink cloudy. So that's when you know the water was in the absinthe, because it would turn a cloudy color. And we see representations of absinthe, certainly in Van Gogh's work. So this is the absinthe glass with it having turned cloudy. And we know that he partook in absinthe for sure, as did many, many artists during that time were certainly maybe inspired, but also plagued by it. So it became very popular. The production of it became huge. And not only did, I would say everyone was drinking absinthe. It was so popular that they called 6 o'clock after work ended was called l'heure verte, the green hour, right? Because that's when you would go to the cafe and start drinking absinthe, right? In the green hour. It was also referred to as the fée verte, the green fairy, which maybe alludes to some of its psychological or psychedelic or hallucinogenic effects. And it was eventually banned. It was banned in 1914 with the kind of excuse that this, the wormwood, no good. It's not working, it's psychedelic, it needs to be banned. There were probably other reasons for it to be banned, basic temperance movements and the alcohol and things like that. It has since made a reappearance, so you can buy absinthe again today. It's probably not, I don't think it's 70% alcohol. It's probably a little bit less, but you can still enjoy it today. But it was sort of blamed as sort of the culprit, or perhaps it was the scapegoat for Van Gogh's eventual downfall, right? Mental illness, his self-mutilation, and possibly even his death. So absinthe is kind of what I'm ending on, maybe not the happiest note, but I think it falls in line with the history of Van Gogh's time, his short time in Provence, and some of the things that he was experiencing as far as tastes and scents and flavors, smells. So, hopefully you've all been inspired by the visual bounty of Van Gogh's work, but I hope that I've given you a little taste, that's kind of ironic, a taste of some of the things that were surrounding him otherwise, sensory-wise, the flavors, the smells, the scents, that probably also inspired him, even though he wasn't able to capture them in the visual art. These were the things that were surrounding him. So I thank you for listening and taking the time to join us today. And I think we're going to be opening the floor up to questions. So if anyone has a question.
Thank you. So my question has to do with your expertise in wine.
Yes.
Why can you drink all the wine you want in Europe and not get a headache? But here, brutal.
So the question is, why can you drink all of the wine you want in Europe, but here, if you drink a lot of wine, you end up with a big headache or something like that? How do I answer this in a very politically nice way? I mean, I think a lot of times when we're in Europe, we're on vacation. So that's another thing. We're in an environment, so imagine yourself in Provence with the sunshine. The wine just hits you better. There's other reasons, depending on what wines you're drinking. There are some wines that are highly manufactured that are available throughout the world, not just here, that have a lot of additives and things like that, and maybe are not the purest. But you do have to understand, like, wine it has many things in it. Depending on the style of wine, it can have sugar, it can have histamine, it can have tannin. Sulfites often gets blamed for it, but sulfites is the only thing that's actually required to be put on a label. So there's many other things that can be added to wine. I mean, wine is sometimes aged in oak barrels. So there's many things that people could be reacting to. I also find that people don't hydrate very well when they're drinking wine, so that can also contribute to it. So there's not really a simple answer to that. I think it has to do a lot with environment and maybe the choices of wine that you're drinking. I tell people, when people tell me they have a problem with getting headaches or things like that, I kind of, I'm a little bit like a doctor diagnosing. I'm like, does it happen with white wine? Does it happen with red wine? Does it happen with rosé wine? Tell me a little bit about the context that it happens. And usually we can come to a happy medium or have something that people have a direction they can try. All right, next question.
Hi, Erika. Thank you for the wonderful talk, and I'm feeling like Aperol maybe soon.
Yeah. Nice.
So I have kind of a two-part question. One is more about the Van Gogh side, and one is more about the rosé and the wine. Mm-hmm. On the Van Gogh side, I'm just so curious. You've been painting this picture of like his diet and his lifestyle. I'm thinking about Dutch people and their toasties, very simple food, whatever it takes to just keep going. And then he goes in the cafe and he drinks coffee and he drinks wine, depressants, and all these things. So I'm just curious whether or not you're aware of whether there's anyone who's tried to kind of replicate that lifestyle to say, hey, do I get to the same degree of kind of mental state that he would get to? So that's my first question. Yeah. And then the second question is, I've heard, for example, modern productions of rosé require a lot of, maybe chemical means in order to stop the fermentation halfway with the wine. I'm just curious about if you can comment on rosés from Provence specifically and how that's evolved over time in its production.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the first question was about Van Gogh's diet. And certainly it doesn't seem very healthy. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that we know who are like that too, right? People who survive on coffee and not a lot of sustenance, but still seem to be driven, right? I can imagine we probably in the modern day have artists and people that we know that they don't eat a lot. They think of food more as just something that they need to eat and not necessarily enjoy eating. There are a few times when you look at some of Van Gogh's letters where he remarks like, oh, when he went to the sea, they made some good fish, good fried fish. So he definitely had a sense of what tasted good and what didn't taste so good. But he certainly wasn't really interested in kind of creating it himself. He was just more concerned about the colors and the lighting, and when you read his letters, he focuses mostly on that. He talks about what he sees and what he paints, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that we know that are like that as well. Hopefully, I can't imagine that was healthy, what he did, and he did, as he was in sort of various recovery times of his life, was saying, I need to eat better, I need to eat healthier. I think he realized that, but it also didn't solve his problems either. So just diet alone wasn't the answer to whatever he was suffering from. The second question was about rosé. Sorry, I'll do this one quickly. So rosé has come in many forms. I know when I was probably first knowledgeable or knew about wine, not knowledgeable about wine, but when I first knew about wine, rosé was often sweet, right? So the White Zinfandels, the Lancers, the Matus, we probably all had that at one point. And those are also rosés. Those would be rosés that they did stop fermentation to leave some sugar behind. And that's a stylistic choice, right? So that was popular at one point. And now what's popular is dry rosé, dry meaning not sweet. And that's where the sugars, the natural sugars in the grapes have been completely fermented into alcohol. So that leaves you usually with a alcohol level of about 12-13%, but very little sugar left in the wine. And that's, it's a cycle that we've seen over time where there were times when really sweet wines were popular. There are times when sort of sweet wines are popular. And then now we are sort of in the dry period where we tend to prefer drier wines, I would say, as a general statement. Everybody has their own taste, so that's just sort of the trends that we see. Yes, question?
Yes, actually, two questions focused on the flavors, tastes, and scents of Provence, but drawing upon your expertise. One would be, do you have a favorite vineyard that you would name in Provence that we can all go see when we visit next? And secondly, what to drink in terms of your favorites from Provence in the white, the rosé, and the red styles?
Yeah. So
and preferably low heat. I don't need a lot of alcohol.
No, yeah. Well, most of the Provence wines are not super high in alcohol. In general, France tends to, they would prefer to have less sort of fruity wines and less alcohol because of that in general in France. But the question is there a particular vineyard that I would recommend in Provence? There are many. Another one that sticks into my mind, the one where I had the dinner outside was called Gros Norey. Gros Norey. So it was again, it's a name that is in tribute to the winemaker's father, whose name was Honoré. So Gros Norey was like a nickname, like, you know, Fat Norey or Big Norey. And that's a very nice winery that's in Bandol. The other winery in Bandol is Château de Pibernon, which is, they make red, white, and rosé wines. But again, in Bandol, it's along the coast, it's this beautiful sort of amphitheater vineyard where the vineyards are actually terraced, and it just like captures the sun. And the grape that is predominant in Bandol is called Mourvèdre. Mourvèdre. It's a dark, kind of meaty grape variety, so it makes these like kind of meaty, like chewy wines that are really good with wild boar, for instance. So that's not necessarily what you want to sip when you're on your yacht in Cannes, but you know, it's something that goes well with some of the more hearty dishes. The surprise that I had when I traveled to Provence, I was kind of dreading having to drink so much rosé. And I'm like, oh my gosh, am I going to drink rosé this whole trip? But I was really surprised that there's some really nice white wines from Provence as well. So grapes like Rolle, R-O-L-L-E, which is the same grape as Vermentino in Italy. That makes a very nice white wine, which is gives me sort of like herbal, kind of pineapple-y type aromas. Certainly tons of rosé. There is one particular winery that makes rosé from a rare grape variety. The grape variety is called Tiborin, and the winery is called Clos Cibon. So if you're sick of sort of the very pale pink rosés and you want to try something a little different from Provence, the Clos Cibon rosés are very nice. And of course, for reds, the Bandol reds. So like Château de Pibernon, Gros Norey, those are very, very distinctive. Right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much. And I hope you get to experience some of these tastes and flavors and scents firsthand, and enjoy the rest of the course. And if you haven't seen the exhibit yet, I hope you do have time to see the exhibit of the Roulin family portraits.